Childhood is a time for love, laughter, and growth. It's a time when a child's imagination runs wild, unburdened by the world's worries. But for Emani Moss, her childhood was far from the joy that every child deserves. Her life was marked by unimaginable suffering, neglect, and betrayal by those she trusted most, her family. This is the heartbreaking story of Emani Moss, a young girl whose life was stolen by abuse and a system that failed to protect her. Emani's story isn't just about tragedy. It's about the importance of vigilance and the urgent need to protect the most vulnerable among us. Let us begin by understanding the life of this young girl. Emani Gabrielle Moss was born on April 23, 2003, in Gwinnett County, Georgia. From the moment she came into the world, Emani faced challenges. Her parents, Emani Moss, and her biological mother struggled with their relationship, and soon after her birth, they separated. Emani's mother had limited involvement in her life, leaving Emani in the primary care of her father, Emmon Moss. Emmon, though described by some as well-meaning, struggled to provide a stable home for his daughter. Financial hardships and emotional difficulties defined much of their life together. In 2009, Emmon Moss remarried. He met Tiffany Moss, a woman who seemed loving and supportive at first. Emani's father likely believed that Tiffany could bring stability into their lives. But what unfolded after Tiffany entered Emani's life was nothing short of a nightmare. Tiffany Moss, a teacher by profession, was supposed to care for and nurture children. Yet, when it came to Emani, her actions were shockingly cruel. From the very beginning, Tiffany treated Emani differently. In 2010, Tiffany's cruelty became public for the first time. Emani was severely beaten with a belt by her stepmother, an act of abuse that left visible scars. When the authorities were notified, Tiffany was arrested and charged with child cruelty. Tiffany pleaded guilty to the charges, and the court sentenced her to probation. During this time, Emani was temporarily removed from her father's home. But after Tiffany completed her probation, Emani was returned to her father and stepmother. The abuse resumed and grew worse. As the years passed, Emani's life in the Moss household became increasingly lonely and cruel. Tiffany Moss, her stepmother, grew more hostile, targeting Emani with neglect and abuse, while her biological children received proper care. Emani was treated as if she didn't belong in her own home. While her step-siblings played, laughed, and ate regular meals, Emani was kept apart, sometimes locked in a room with little to no food. This wasn't just neglect, it was deliberate. Tiffany viewed Emani as an inconvenience, not as a child deserving of love and care. Despite her isolation at home, Emani did attend school for some time. But even there, signs of abuse were clear to those who paid attention. Teachers reported seeing Emani arrive at school with bruises and wearing clothes that didn't fit. Teachers and counselors noted Emani's shrinking frame and quiet demeanor. She rarely spoke, and when she did, her voice was barely above a whisper. Her small stature at first seemed normal for her age, but as months passed, it became evident something was wrong. Despite these warning signs, no effective action was taken. Emani's cries for help, silent though they were, went unheard. Tiffany's abuse intensified. She began systematically starving Emani, depriving her of basic sustenance. Emani's body weakened as days turned into weeks with little food. By 2013, her weight had dropped to a shocking 32 pounds, about the same weight as a healthy toddler. For a child, hunger is a cruel and relentless pain. Emani's malnutrition left her body frail, her movements slow, and her energy non-existent. Her hair thinned. Her skin turned pale and dry, clinging to her fragile bones. Even the simplest movements became painful. Starvation robbed Emani not just of her health, but of her childhood. Meanwhile, Tiffany Moss continued to feed and care for her own biological children, showing a chilling divide in how she treated Emani versus the rest of the family. But the abuse wasn't just physical, it was emotional as well. Tiffany systematically stripped away Emani's confidence, making her feel worthless and unwanted. For a child like Emani, hearing those words daily was devastating. She began to believe the lies her stepmother told her. To the outside world, the Moss family appeared normal. Tiffany and Emani Moss took care to hide the extent of Emani's suffering. They avoided bringing her to public places or medical appointments. When neighbors asked about Emani, Tiffany often dismissed their concerns, saying Emani was trouble or acting out. This narrative, combined with Emani's silence, allowed the abuse to continue unchecked. By October 2013, Emani's body was failing her. She could barely walk, let alone attend school or play like other children. Her condition was critical, but no one intervened. Tiffany and Emani Moss knew Emani needed medical help, but instead of seeking treatment, they chose to let her suffer. Tiffany believed that taking Emani to a doctor would expose the abuse. In her final days, Emani was completely alone. She spent hours lying in pain, her body too weak to even cry out for help. The level of neglect and cruelty Emani endured was incomprehensible. She was only 10 years old, a child whose life should have been filled with love and laughter, but instead was marked by suffering and isolation. Her death was not just a result of her stepmother's actions, but of a system that failed her at every turn. One day in late October 2013, Tiffany Moss called Emani Moss at work. Her voice was calm, but carried an urgency that would set the stage for a horrific discovery. Emmon didn't ask questions. Over the past few months, Tiffany's treatment of Emani had escalated, and he had learned not to challenge her authority. But as he drove home, a sense of dread crept over him. When Emmon arrived home, he found Tiffany standing in the hallway, her expression cold and detached. She led him to the bathroom, where Emani's frail body was lying in the tub. She was unresponsive, her small frame barely recognizable from the effects of prolonged starvation. According to Emmon's later confession, Tiffany claimed that Emani had a seizure before collapsing in the bathroom. But the signs of abuse and neglect on her body told a different story. Her body was emaciated, her bones protruding sharply under her skin. There were dark bruises along her arms and legs, and her face was hollow, with sunken eyes that showed the toll of months of suffering. Emmon's reaction was not one of shock or grief. It was fear. Not fear for Emani, but fear of what this would mean for him and Tiffany. He knew they had crossed a line that could no longer be hidden. After discovering Emani's lifeless body in the bathtub, Emani Moss made a decision that defies all understanding. Instead of reporting her death or seeking help, he carried her fragile body out of the bathroom and placed her in her bed. For days, Emmon and Tiffany lived with Emani's body in the apartment. They closed the door to her room, trying to shut out the reality of what they had done. But the haunting presence of her remains lingered. Emmon carefully laid Emani down on her bed, as if she were still alive, tucking the blanket around her. He couldn't bring himself to face what had happened, and yet he didn't take action to make it right. This act wasn't born out of love or grief, it was denial. By placing her in bed, Emmon tried to create a facade of normalcy, as though hiding her body would somehow erase the guilt of their actions. For days, Emani's lifeless body remained in her room. While Emmon and Tiffany went about their lives, Emani was left to decay in the very place that should have been her sanctuary. Emmon later admitted that he stayed in the room with Emani's body at times, unable or unwilling to leave. Instead of taking responsibility, he allowed his daughter's body to lie there, untreated and ignored. He described feeling paralyzed, consumed by fear of the consequences they would face. But this paralysis didn't come from grief or shock. It came from self-preservation. As the days passed, the reality of Emani's death began to manifest in ways that couldn't be ignored. The smell of decay began to seep from her room, a physical reminder of their unspeakable actions. Tiffany and Emmon tried to avoid the room, but they knew they couldn't continue like this. Yet even in those moments, they failed to show remorse or take responsibility. Their focus remained on hiding their crimes. In interviews and court testimonies, Emmon claimed that he felt trapped by Tiffany's control and feared the consequences of exposing what had happened. But his decision to keep Emani's body in the house for days was not an act of helplessness. It was a choice. Throughout this time, neither Emmon nor Tiffany showed compassion for Emani. Their actions revealed not only their disregard for her life, but their willingness to erase her humanity even in death. By leaving Emani's body in her bed, they robbed her of dignity, even in her final moments. Their inaction was not just a failure as parents. It was a chilling testament to the depth of their neglect and cruelty. After keeping her body in their apartment for several days, Emmon and Tiffany decided to cover up her death. Emmon wrapped Emani's remains in a trash bag and placed her inside a large garbage can. They then poured charcoal into the can, intending to burn her body to hide the evidence of their abuse and neglect. However, the attempt to burn her remains was unsuccessful. Emmon later took the garbage can with Emani's body back to the apartment, and he reportedly went to work with her body still in his truck before eventually contacting the police. The tragic and inhumane treatment of Emani's body underscores the unimaginable cruelty of her parents and their disregard for her dignity, even in death. On November 2, 2013, Emani Moss made a decision that would finally bring this horrific case to light. He called 911. "My child, she's dead. I don't know what to do," he said. Emmon claimed that Emani had died from drinking chemicals, a desperate attempt to shift blame away from the months of abuse and neglect. But his calm demeanor during the call raised immediate suspicion. Police arrived at the family's apartment complex in Lawrenceville, Georgia, to find Emmon standing next to a large garbage can. Inside, they discovered the charred remains of Emani Moss. Investigators were horrified. The scene painted a picture of unimaginable cruelty. A young girl, robbed of her life and dignity by the very people who were supposed to protect her. Emmon and Tiffany Moss were immediately taken into custody. Emmon quickly confessed to police, detailing how Tiffany had starved and abused Emani while he failed to intervene. His confession implicated them both, leaving no room for doubt about their guilt. Tiffany, however, remained cold and silent. She denied responsibility and showed no remorse for Emani's death. Both Emmon and Tiffany Moss were charged with multiple counts, including felony murder, child cruelty, and concealing a death. While Emmon cooperated with investigators, Tiffany refused to take accountability for her actions. In a move to avoid the death penalty, Emani Moss accepted a plea deal. He pled guilty to felony murder and agreed to testify against Tiffany in exchange for a sentence of life in prison without the possibility of parole. During his testimony, Emmon broke down, expressing regret for his role in Emani's death. He admitted his failure to protect her, but claimed he was under Tiffany's control, a claim that did little to redeem him in the eyes of the public. Tiffany Moss's trial began in April 2019, nearly 6 years after Emani's death. She chose to represent herself in court, a decision that shocked both legal experts and the public. Tiffany's self-representation proved to be a disaster. She failed to cross-examine witnesses, presented no evidence, and offered no defense. The prosecution, on the other hand, laid out a damning case against her. Prosecutors presented autopsy photos showing Emani's emaciated body and detailed the extent of her starvation and abuse. Witnesses testified about the Moss family's troubled history, painting a picture of relentless cruelty. Through it all, Tiffany showed no emotion. She sat in silence as her actions were laid bare for the court to see. On April 30th, 2019, Tiffany Moss was found guilty on all counts, including murder, child cruelty, and concealing a death. The jury recommended the death penalty. Tiffany Moss became the first woman in Georgia to be sentenced to death in more than 5 years. She was sent to the Georgia Diagnostic and Classification Prison, where she awaits execution by lethal injection. The tragic death of Emani Moss left an indelible mark on everyone who heard her story. It was a stark reminder of the dangers of unchecked abuse and the failure of the systems designed to protect children. In the years since her death, Emani's story has inspired calls for reform in child protective services and greater accountability for caregivers. While justice was served in the courtroom, it came too late for Emani. Emani Moss's life was cut short, but her memory lives on. Her story is a painful reminder of the importance of vigilance, compassion, and advocacy for the most vulnerable among us. Emani Moss was a bright, beautiful young girl whose life was stolen far too soon. She deserved love, safety, and a chance to grow up, to dream, to laugh, to live. While we cannot undo the pain she endured, we can honor her by ensuring her story is never forgotten. Rest in peace, Emani. May you find the love and peace in heaven that you were so cruelly denied on earth. You are forever in our hearts. Thank you for taking the time to hear Emani Moss's story. Stories like this are heartbreaking but important. They remind us to stay vigilant and protect the vulnerable. If this video moved you, please consider subscribing to our channel for more in-depth stories like this one. Don't forget to like this video and turn on notifications so you never miss our latest uploads. Your support helps us share these stories and continue the conversation about important issues. And most importantly, stay safe. If you or someone you know is in a harmful situation, speak out, seek help, and remember, you are never alone. Together, we can make a difference. Thank you for watching, and we'll see you in the next video.